This first professor overview for Module 1 focuses on what is reading and what is literacy. Before any discussion of literacy, it is important that everyone involved have a common understanding of what is meant by the terms reading and literacy. As teachers, each of you needs to analyze and develop your own definitions for these terms. During this presentation, think about what role literacy plays in your content area. Think about how you define reading and literacy, and most importantly, think about why it matters for you and your students that you have a good definition of reading and literacy in mind. In the beginning, or how did written language start? A very simple history. Most, if not all, species need to communicate. Every early human lived in a small family group, making communication fairly easy. Think about your own family and the many ways you can communicate with one another, sometimes without a single word. We don't know for sure, but we assume their communication needs centered around the basics of eating, staying safe, moving about, and surviving. However, as humans began living in larger groups and establishing communities, communication became more difficult and far more essential to the developing societies. Humans found they needed to communicate more effectively and systematically. So they developed systems, codes that stood for common meanings. Based on studies of indigenous peoples, historical evidence, and observations of other species, we can assume that early humans used specific sounds, expressions, gestures, symbols, pictures, etc. to represent important ideas and concepts. These specific codes were shared between groups that regularly interacted and passed from one generation to the next. Oral language was, and still is, essential for the success and survival of society. With it, humans developed and preserved tradition, economy, community, and advancement in all areas. As society became more complex, the oral language was not sufficient to keep up with the progress of human society, so written language, something that could be recorded, saved, transmitted, and understood from group to group over time, was developed. Like oral language, it was simply a code to preserve and transmit meaning. Genre, which is created by a society, represents the most efficient way of getting something done that a culture has at a given point in time. In this sense, genre is functional. Even though we tend to think language is static, we are living in a time when a whole new genre, instant messaging, and especially text messaging, is being developed. It is the most efficient way of communicating given the technology now available. How exciting, and who knows what the next 10 years will bring. Sometimes in the push to educate our students, we lose track, and so do they, of the only reason human beings use written language to begin with, to communicate with one another. Yes, decoding the codes is essential, but it is only a tool, not the end product. It is a useless tool if students don't understand that there is supposed to be an end product, meaning. Messages like the one here are certainly not grammatically correct and may be every English teacher's nightmare, but they do serve their purpose. In a print-heavy world, it is important for us to remember that literacy is all about communication and involves reading, writing, speaking, listening, and viewing. We read a piece of art when we view it, and we read music when we listen to it. The creator's purpose was to communicate meaning in some way, and the receiver's purpose is to determine what was meant. As you will see later in this presentation, it's a very complex process. Within the code of written language are other codes unique to specific subjects and specialty areas. Have you ever watched or listened to two mathematicians or physicists communicate? To them, all the marks and squiggles mean something. Huge concepts and ideas are summed up in single symbols. If you aren't a sports person, have you ever tried listening to a sports broadcast and been able to understand half of what they are saying? All of these subjects, writers in any subject area, social studies, math, science, sports, economics, assume their readers have knowledge of these codes specific to that subject. How many of your students have knowledge of the codes in the subjects that we expect them to read? Reading is the knowledge of these codes, how they work, what they mean, and how to integrate them into a meaningful whole to access the content and change in some big or small way our lives. Play The Miracle Worker, William Gibson shows us what happened when Annie Sullivan first met Helen's mother. Annie was to be Helen's teacher, and Annie's response reinforces the purpose of language and languages transmitted through code, be it signed, oral, or written. Mrs. Keller asked, "What will you teach her first?" And Annie replied, "First, last, and in between, language." And Mrs. Keller said, "Language?" And to that Annie replied, "Language is to the mind more than light is to the eye." One of the best demonstrations of the difference between the code and the meaning is the moment Helen Keller discovered that difference. Watch now as we see the video, an older video that shows this particular scene.
W-A-T-E-R, water. It has a name. W-A-T. Yes. Oh, my dear. Round. Yes. Plump.
That's the difference between reading as decoding and reading as meaning making. Helen had known all the codes for letters in sign language for some time and couldn't make sense out of them until the moment she relates it in the quote above from her own writing, shown on the screen. Despite her knowing these codes, it wasn't sufficient until she understood that they represented something. Helen discovered the ability to communicate, and it changed her life forever. How many of our students are just like Helen? So, what is reading? I think a very good quote that sums up this century-old debate is from Huey. The first great scholar of the psychology of and pedagogy of reading observed that to completely analyze what we do when we read would almost be the acme of a psychologist's achievements, for it would be to describe some of the most intricate workings of the human mind. Over the many, many years, different people from different philosophies have studied reading and learning and come up with different definitions. Reading definitions vary depending on the stage of reading development being considered. Are we looking at pre-reading, early reading, when children are just learning to decode, or are we looking at a time when someone knows how to decode but has to tackle difficult material, as in content area classes? The point of view toward reading as a visual task, a word recognition task, a thinking process, or a social event, and this will be explored in detail soon. And then one's assumptions about learning in general. Since reading is a learned process, definitions of reading reflect different assumptions about learning. This chart represents two ends of a continuum from behaviorist theory to cognitive theory. And here's a little arrow just to let you think about that there are people on both sides and people right in the middle. Each column summarizes a distinct perspective opposite from the other. Both perspectives have and continue to influence reading and writing instruction in our schools. Most people approach learning through a blend of these two perspectives, but you will also find people who lean further to one end of the continuum between the two than the other. Can you place people you know or teachers you've worked with on this continuum? Where do you place yourself? Do you feel that the learner reproduces meaning or the learner constructs meaning? That learning is activated and initiated by others, or that learning is activated and initiated by the learner? That motivation is directed by others, or motivation is self-directed? That learning is driven by the text, or that learning is driven by the learner? That learning is linear and hierarchical, or that learning is holistic and patterned? That learning features skill development, that learning features problem solving? That effective comprehension requires automaticity of basic skills, or that effective comprehension relates learning to prior knowledge and experience? Historical analysis of the way we define reading can be fascinating to some. If you are one of those people, take a look at the resource cited here, the Literacy Dictionary, the Vocabulary of Reading and Writing. It's a wonderful overview of the history of reading definitions. For our purposes, we will briefly explore the influence of various perspectives on the definition and corresponding teaching of reading. In addition to behavioral and cognitive theorists, psychologists, linguists, sociologists, and anthropologists have contributed to the discussion, which is sometimes very heated, about what reading is and how it should be taught. As you will see, sometimes they forget that the primary reason we use the tool of reading is to communicate. Distinguishing the separate letters both by the eye and the ear, in order that when you later hear them spoken or see them written, you will not be confused by their position. That was way back from Plato's time. 1938, nothing more than the correlation of a sound image with its corresponding visual image. This basically sums up the part-to-whole concept that those two quotes represent. It's a bottom-up view. It focuses very much on learning to pronounce words and to decode the text. The assumption is that once that happens, meaning will take care of itself. Again, this is one far end of the continuum. Later, this view was extended to include comprehension and the related thinking processes. Reading is reasoning. Reading is an understanding not only of the literal or sense meaning of a passage, but also the meanings implied by the author's mood, his tone, his intent, and himself. The central thought processes by means of which meaning is put into symbols appearing on the print page. Toward mid-century, definitions of reading became more and more cognitively oriented. Reading is the reconstruction of the events behind the symbols. Reading is an interaction between the reader and the written language, through which the reader attempts to reconstruct a message from the writer. Notice we're bringing the reader in here now, not just paying attention to the printed word on the page or the author. Reading is the perception and comprehension of written messages in a manner paralleling that of corresponding spoken messages. There are three terms: transactional theory, reader response theory, and psycholinguistic theory, that all mean basically the same thing and all relate to this aspect of the reader, the text, and the poem. And let me explain each of those. First, just want to briefly mention Louise Rosenblatt. Her work is pivotal in transactional theory and in the learning of reading, and so she's a name you might want to have in mind. She proposed that every reading act consisted of the reader, who's the person who wants to make meaning, the text, which is a collection of words, symbols, and patterns on a page produced by an author, and the poem, which in her mind isn't a poem like we think. It's whatever is created when the reader transacts with the text. So when these two transact together, the resulting meaning is the poem. And this kind of summarizes that particular theory. Learning to read means learning to bring meaning to a text in order to get meaning from or understand a text. It's a psycholinguistic view. Notice psycho being involving the mind and linguistic language, so combination of the reader's mind and the language. And it's an interplay between the mind of the reader, the language of the text, and the context which surround both. Here's a very important word: schema. Schema is the mental representation a person has for any given idea or concept. For example, if I say cat, all of you listening to this have automatically pictured a cat. If you could all draw your cat for us or get a photograph of your cat, most of them would be different because your experiences with cats are all varied based on where you've been and who you are. You have emotions connected to it, you have 5 senses connected to it, and all of that information is stored in what I love to talk to the children about is file folders in your brain. So there's a file folder in your brain for cats, and you store all that information in that file folder, and that's your schema. And when someone says the word cat, or when you read the C, the A, and the T, and you recognize as the word cat, your brain goes to that folder and pulls out everything it has. Reading is a transaction between the mind, the schema and personal context of the reader, and the language of the text, in a particular situational social context. Thus, reading means bringing meaning to a text in order to get meaning from it. And perhaps most crucially, learning to read means learning to bring meaning to a text in order to construct meaning. Meaning is not in the text, but arises during a transaction between the words and the receiver of the language. In this case, another important, two important vocabulary words: speakers and writers encode a message. So an author or a speaker will use codes to put a message together, whereas readers and listeners and viewers decode a message. The reader constructs a personal text which is parallel to but not equivalent to the written text. The reason that's so in this theory is your schema and the environment in which you are have been brought up in or are currently in all interact to make a personal text, a new meaning. So these different words bring a big however to what we just talked about. Reading is not merely a psycholinguistic, the reader's mind and the text process involving a transaction between the mind of the reader and the language of the text. Reading is a socio-psycholinguistic process, and this term became popular in the 2000s. Connie Weaver is one person who wrote about it, but there were many who did. Reading also involves a person's culture, their ethnicity, their socioeconomic status, their age, their education level, their interests, their language, the situation, location, the mood at the time of reading, your values, your purposes. It involves a whole sociological context that plays a part in the way you interpret the text. Some of the contexts that influence how we interpret a text or how we bring meaning to a text are grammatical or syntactical contexts. So this is parts of speech and elements of the written language. This goes back to way in the beginning with the letters and the codes. These are the codes that we use to bring certain meaning to language, and that is one of the contexts that we use to make meaning. Another one is the semantic context, and that's the associations we make, the schema we bring. A third is the situational or pragmatic context, and that's what's going on around us. The purpose of the reading, the social situation, plays a huge part in content area reading. And then the personal or schematic context, individual prior knowledge, experiences, expectations, schema, assumptions, the knowledge in our head. This brings us to literacy. Literacy, I'm just going to read this because it's a very pivotal definition, is a minimal ability to read and write in a designate language as well as a mindset or way of thinking about the use of reading and writing in everyday life. It differs from simple reading and writing in its assumption of an understanding of the appropriate use of these abilities within a print-based society. And this is what we've been talking about all along. It's taking the tool of reading and writing and understanding how it's used in society. Literacy, therefore, requires active, autonomous engagement with print and stresses the role of the individual in generating as well as receiving and assigning independent interpretations to messages. In current usage, the term implies an interaction between social demands and individual competence. Thus, the levels of literacy required for social functioning can and have varied across cultures and across time within the same culture. What was required for literacy in the time of Columbus is assumed to be different from what is required for literacy in industrialized nations today. Corresponding to literacy is illiteracy. This is the unwillingness to use literacy even though the capability is present. Illiteracy reflects a change in cultural values and a loss of skills, both which threaten the process of a free and democratic society. Literacy knits people together, gives them a common culture, and provides people with the intellectual tools used to question, challenge, understand, disagree, and arrive at consensus. Illiteracy, on the other hand, leads inexorably to a two-tiered society, the knowledgeable elite and the masses. It makes a common culture illusory or impossible, and it erodes the basis for effective decision-making and participation in the democratic process. Can the definition of reading we have in use for instruction create a culture of illiteracy? I would argue it absolutely can and does. So why have we spent all this time to go over these definitions? Because children's success in reading depends on their reading strategies, and because their reading strategies reflect their implicit definition of reading. Where does that come from? Their definitions often reflect the instructional approach that they've experienced. And where does that instructional approach come from? The instructional approaches we use reflect our definition of reading. Students will most likely develop reading strategies and literacy attitudes based on their teachers' definitions and perceptions of reading and learning to read. So ultimately, children's success in reading depends on our definition of reading and literacy. What's your definition?